To me, it seems like Americans are less intellectual because they're so limited to their own culture. They think they're on top of the world. The US is not this magical place where you get off the plane and then you get $1 million because you landed. Like, there's more opportunities in Canada because it's more undiscovered.
What have you learned about running a business at such a young age, Max?
No, I noticed that a lot of people, they underestimate you based on how you look. So if you appear to be younger, they think that you're less experienced, and that's true to some extent, but at the same time, I believe that can hinder your progress just because you feel this imposter syndrome that you're not qualified just because you're young or something. Just because people who are successful that you see online, that you see in your feed, are older and more mature looking.
Right.
And that's one of the, like kind of like imposter syndrome aspects that get imposed onto you from the outside world. That's something I learned that kind of like gave me this, stopped me from moving forward as fast as I could have. Another
Really?
thing, yeah, another thing I would share would be starting a business when you're in your early 20s, or me, I was 19 when I first started out. It takes quite a lot of um, learning in terms of how to make mistakes and then get up again to see what went wrong. So it's like this diagram I learned from Ray Dalio, where something happens, you basically fail, and then the core is to learn what went wrong to adjust in the next version and then do it again, do it again. That's what I briefly mentioned before we started, that I noticed that it's not really working out the way I was expecting it to. So now it's time to alternate to do version 2, 3, 4, and 5. So yeah, those are probably the two biggest aspects.
Is that kind of intimidating for you? Like, was it intimidating for you at first to learn about like what failure was, how to kind of incorporate it into a strategy rather than thinking of it as like an insurmountable boundary for you?
Yeah, of course it took time because at the end of the day, you're playing with your ego. You know, you think that the first thing you do has to be successful because you put so
Right.
much energy toward it. But the world doesn't care about the energy you put in. It cares about the value you can get from it, you know. And after all, like I said, it's all about getting outsider feedback, getting feedback from your customers, from your users. That's what I learned myself. And I learned that success lies where you start listening to what people have to say rather than having to impose your own belief of success onto your product. Like thinking that, oh, because I think it's the way it's supposed to be, this is the right version. But obviously, if it fails, you have to adjust. And I'm fine with that and over time. But of course, the first time I started, it was like an ego game, I think.
For sure. And you talked about pivoting, and I think that it leads into my next question, which is during the pandemic, everybody had to pivot. It seems like everybody was forced to kind of reconfigure the way that they thought, reconfigure the lifestyles that they led, and they kind of forced them into a box which they had to transcend. So in your case, and this is the same for me, like I started writing about artificial intelligence during the pandemic, and it just completely shifted my mindset on what I value and the kind of ethics I hold. So for you, what did you learn during the pandemic? And I know that we talked before, you started I'm Canada during the pandemic, if I remember correctly. So
That's right.
what was that like? What struggles did you face during the pandemic? Was it a kind of like a lot of external like input and output, or was it just like you built from the bottom up?
I think we need to break it down into two parts, like
Sure.
the first half of the pandemic and then the second half. Because the second half, that's when the war in Ukraine started, and then the first half is when the pandemic hit. So when it first started, I thought it was a blessing because I never had the time to start building my community, and I really wanted to start as soon as I could. But then schoolwork, my part-time job, and then something else always got in the way. Versus the pandemic started, I ordered the equipment and I just told myself that I'm going to commit to one video a week on YouTube, long format, and see how I can benefit others with the mistakes I made so they can avoid them. And for me, that was my immigrant community. And now I built the largest community of international students in Canada at about 200,000, 250,000 members across different platforms. But, I started from zero, and I remember how it took me like 6 months to get to, I think, 200 or 300 subscribers. But again, I think I was very bad. And the problem that I had is I had to learn how to iterate, how to notice small feedback points from my audience that would tell me, oh, the audio is back on the technical side, or um, the way you explained this didn't make sense. So how can I go back to the drawing board and re-script, make a different script that makes more sense, maybe bring more analogies, those small incremental things that make a bigger picture. I think when you start anything new, it's kind of like you're pushing this rock that's like square shape up the hill, but then over time you shape it into like this rounded rock, so you curve the
Mm,
edges, and then eventually it becomes easier, and the hill becomes either the degree goes down, or it just becomes less stiff for you to do it. So yeah, I think it's the first half where I thought it was great, but then I had to learn how to, again, ego game. I had to learn how to not think myself that the content is great, but rather listen to my audience. And then the second half was when I started getting some success. I had quit my job at that time. I worked at IKEA, minimum wage. It was so crazy, but eventually over, I think it was a year in, I started making money. I started getting customers to our immigration company. And then eventually I think when the war in Ukraine started, that was like a different type of challenge because my family's there. So I had my mom over for like 6 months, and because of the news and everything that was happening, I had to set office hours. I was like,
right.
from this time to this time I work. Like I put on the focus mode on my phone and my iPad, and then nothing can really disturb me because it's just too much to let that distraction, let that unprecedented time really get to you in a way where it ruins the progress you've made.
I want to get to the war in Ukraine because I know it had a pretty significant effect on you. But just to detail what you were talking previously about, the kind of you use the criticism, or I guess the constructive feedback that you got from your audience to better yourself and to better your platform. How did you use, like, how did you interpret it as as constructive and not hate? I feel like it's a very fine line, especially on these social platforms where people just say whatever they want. And I've dealt with that too, where it's people like give you some advice, but that's also like it's kind of like a backhand, it's like a backhanded compliment. So how did you deal with um breaking into that space and dealing with getting better, but also responding to your audience's inquiries?
We spoke about it during our first meeting, I remember, and something that I think to myself is, let's say you're walking on the street and a random homeless person yells something at you, maybe like a slur or something, whatever, because the value they bring is so little that it doesn't matter what they say. At least that's what it is to me. Like it just, it goes over my head. I don't really care. But
Mhm.
then if, for example, it's somebody I look up to, or I don't know, somebody close to me, like my parents, if they criticize me on something, I would probably listen, and then it would get to me, no matter if I tried to limit that or not. So I think it's the same concept online. If the person criticizing is not successful, then their value is low. So they have not really much of an impact, versus if it's from someone who's accomplished great stuff in your industry, and then they say that, oh, this is kind of bad, then I would listen. And usually people who are somewhat successful, they never criticize without something constructive behind it. So,
Mhm.
like, for example, again, they could talk about my script, but they wouldn't talk about, I don't know, the way I look or something like that.
Right, right. So it kind of was based off of the person's persona rather than what they said, and that's what you went off of
Yeah, I always
in terms
separate
of the
them
hate
because,
comments.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, if you ask, I don't know, if a 5-year-old to explain calculus to you, or you ask a professor, they have different
Yeah.
value, right?
Yeah,
Somebody
yeah.
who's done a lot of stuff in it, rather that. So again, like to me, people who have like a username which is like user 325 and then they say something, it doesn't really hold any value.
Right, right. No, it's a good mindset. Was this like, did you come into building your platform with this mindset, or is this something that you realize like, oh, this actually holds no value. It's not a communication of my character. It's just noise.
You know, I interestingly had surrounded myself by a lot of different people who are successful in the area I want to be successful in. And I don't think that it's always good. Like everything has another side to it, but it made me realize that because they also spoke about it a lot. So before I had started, I had kind of like learned this strategy. They spoke about, oh, this person said this, but then they're irrelevant because they're just not who I want to be around with or who brings me anything of value. So I think I learned it somewhere, but then again, it's bad because if you surround yourself with people like that, again, that's another side of it. Probably I'm getting sidetracked, but you eventually start feeling like you're missing out because you have a feed full of achievements. Like one person is doing that, another person is doing that, and then you have 10 people, and then it looks like you're doing nothing compared to them, you know?
Yeah, 100%. Then I guess that definitely leads into the next question. I guess the biggest question of the podcast, which is you're the founder of I'm Canada, and you're also the founder of the newly formed Immigrant Wealth. My first question is why Canada? What's so great about Canada? What made you realize the power and opportunity that Canada has?
I think it's so multidimensional. I always think to myself after I answer this question, because I've been asked this so many times by my audience and other people on different interviews, and I feel that perhaps, have you ever seen a blue rose?
I've not.
Okay, so I recently learned that blue roses don't exist in nature. They have to be essentially manufactured. So they're placed in this liquid with blue dye. So they eventually absorb it and then become kind of blue with that blue tint. So unlike red roses or white roses, they don't exist. They have to be made. They have to be seek. That's why a blue rose means impossible. It stands for impossible or hard to find, something like that. So it's interesting how that story translates into my journey because I had lived in the US and I would say the US is like a red rose. It's something everybody knows about. It's classic. A lot of immigrants move there. So when I was little, I always had this American dream moving to the States. And then when it happened, I kind of like, I couldn't stay there, first of all, legally speaking, because of some implications. And then over time, I could have, but then I decided to just drop the idea because it's not essentially what people think it is, not necessarily the best country. I had the I guess privilege to have compared different countries. I lived in New Zealand, I lived in the US, Ukraine, Europe, and I just realized that for me Canada is that blue rose. It's hard to find. You have to kind of manufacture it just because it's not a lot of media around it. Like Canada is so under discovered, I think, compared to the States. Like there's so very little information on it. So
Do you
I
have
kind of,
specific examples of like what kind of comparison, like the undiscovery of Canada compared to the States?
yeah, on the, I guess if you talk about the immigration side of it, among immigrants who are outside both Canada or the US, when people talk about Canada, it's always like, they say it's just like the US but cold, or it's
Okay.
Toronto, Toronto this.
Yeah.
So it's just so little information, and then it's kind of like also wrong about it that it's like the US, or it's somewhat like the US but it's not the US. And then it's also, for example, people say like, oh, Canada, like it's hard to get a job there, to find anything, things are overpriced. It's hard to, like, now there's this around inflation, there's this I guess misconception that it's very hard to make it in Canada, versus I think it's hard to make it anywhere. So the US is not this magical place where you get off the plane and then you get $1 million because you landed. It's different. Like it's not that,
Yeah.
and it's the same anywhere. You need to build for success. You need to add value before you can ask for anything, for rewards for that value, like money or anything else. So yeah, I think the biggest misconception is probably that in the US it's easy to make it as an immigrant versus Canada is very expensive, hard, and impossible.
Interesting. And you talked about the experiences in the US that kind of reformulated your plan and pushed you towards Canada. So was it just the US that pushed you towards Canada, or was it your experiences in New Zealand, in Europe, in Ukraine as well?
Yeah, so with the US, I lived in Boise, Idaho, which is not the place I would recommend essentially. I mean, it was high school. It was like
No offense to
very
Idaho.
no offense to Idaho. It's very American, like it's very white. So my high school was most like there was I think out of 2,000 people, we only had three international students. So it's very much the opposite of multicultural. Of course, we had different colors and stuff like that, but mostly white, like 80% white. We had some black kids and Latino and stuff, but then so underrepresented and so like little compared to white American. And, it's I don't mean to sound inconsiderate, but then it's still not the environment I would want to be around. Like that's why I chose Canada. I think it's one of the biggest benefits is that you develop so mm, passively because you're surrounded with so many cultures that by default you learn how the world works from different people. Like now I know what happened in, I don't know, Iran before 1979. So I'm more like aware of world events versus in the US, they think the US is the whole world. And then there's somewhere, there's Canada and then Mexico for vacation, you know, that's it. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's like the biggest thing for me. A lot of them, it's not everybody. I'm sure, like for example, I visited some bigger cities, Seattle, and I've been to Washington, stuff like that. But it's just not as, I guess, I don't want to sound like offensive, but to me it seems like Americans are less intellectual because they're so limited to their own culture. They think they're on top of the world, and that's the very thing that hinders them.
Interesting. And so I see two parts of this kind of identity that you formed. It's the fact that America, as you said, is in your words, it's limited in terms of like their capacity to recognize other cultures. And then you also saw an opportunity in Canada to establish the identity of Canada as, a place that's equal, if not better than, places like America, places in Europe as well, which is very interesting. And when did you see that opportunity? Did you live in America and then just look at Canada and like, oh, okay, there's an opportunity here? Or did you always have that inclination like Canada is that place? The stars had to align for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Originally, I had planned to stay in New Zealand. I thought that I would go there to study and eventually like perhaps move to Australia or root down in New Zealand. But then I learned very quickly that it's a small country. There's not a lot of opportunities compared to the market we see in North America. So the US is, known as the biggest capitalist society in the world, and it's very like business oriented. Even like the way they do healthcare does a lot, and that's their nature, which is good and bad. It's good because you have more opportunities to make money, but then it's bad if you're on the other side of it, if you're not that like business focused, and if you want to just have a good life and work for someone, have the security. It's difficult in the US, versus New Zealand is like very balanced. It's 5 p.m. Everybody goes to the beach with a bottle of wine. People are enjoying sunset. But, for me, I wanted something bigger. Like I wanted that hustle, but then I knew that the US is good, but then it's not as like there's more opportunities in Canada because it's more undiscovered as of now. Like there's more business opportunities just because the market is also quite interesting, but it's not as competitive as the US. It's not as hard to get through as in the US. So therefore, and also the accent, like to be honest with you, the Kiwi accent, I struggle very much. So I just wanted to be in North America. But
For
then
sure,
again, Canada
for
was
sure.
leading the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
don't tell my brother that he was born in Wellington, so he's
Oh,
not going to agree with
yeah.
you on that. And I was born in Australia. I was born in Sydney,
Oh,
so
you told me you're so multinational too. Look at you.
I know. I just, we're part of this. We're cut from the same cloth. Um,
Yeah.
so you realize that Canada was an opportunity for you and for you to start a business. You come to Canada, and then what has your experience? Obviously, the pandemic hits, and you want to start this online community for international students. So, what does your journey look like through both of these businesses? We already talked about the kind of constructive feedback, and you had to reiterate, but was it smooth sailing for you? Like, was it just incremental steps, and you didn't face any boundaries or rough waters, or was it kind of you had to overcome constant boundaries?
Yeah, and I think the biggest boundary, like it's first of all, it's never been smooth sailing for me. It's always been difficult from the beginning, just because you're starting something new. As I said, it's like, trying to push that rock up the hill. But at the same time, it's mostly mental and the challenges you have because you're questioning yourself. Am I doing the right thing with my time? Maybe there's something else I could be doing that brings more value and impact. And then there's people that tell you it's not going to work out because look at your numbers, like you only have 95 subscribers or something. And again, like for example, that was my dad. I remember how he told me in 3 months after doing this, he was like, you've already wasted so much time, like it's time to find a real job or do something productive. And the thing is, again, he is not qualified enough to give me that advice because he doesn't bring enough knowledge to the table since he hasn't done it himself. Maybe if he was like a successful community builder, influencer, whatever you want to call it, then probably I would have listened more. But I was also sure that because some people are texting me, like it was very little, maybe it would be like 1 or 2 DMs a week. Somebody would say, oh, your video helped me so much. How about this problem? Like, how can I overcome this? So it told me that there's demand, there's people who need this stuff. So I thought, okay, so eventually, somehow I'm gonna monetize it. But for now, let's just keep like delivering for free, free. And then, over time, as you again iterate, as you improve what you do, if you're trying to always learn how can I make it just like 1% better, over time it gets to more people, and over time you get that virality that you're looking for. But anything good takes time.
You've touched on this once or twice already, ego. What has your ego done for you? It seems like your ego is the biggest, not you, but the ego in terms of the concept. It seems like the ego has been the biggest um, source of like resistance, or it's been the biggest kind of antagonist for you. So can you speak to how your ego has like changed over time throughout the construction of this business, and how you perceive your ego now, and how you could how you kind of dissolve it in a sense?
Yeah, I think in general, it's like the more you learn, the more you understand how little you know. And the same goes for ego. Like it's like the more you do something like a business like this, the more you understand that there is like a bigger fish, and then there's more things to accomplish, that you're not essentially on top of the world, and your stuff is not necessarily good because you think it is good. It's very subjective. You need to zoom out and look at your community in general, or like other people, what their feedback is, and then compare that to what you think is, and then shift a little bit side by,
Mhm.
because you don't need to like essentially change who you are just because of your community. But I'm a strong believer in incremental changes and making small steps towards again a different version. And your ego is just a big enemy in general if you don't know how to control it, because it can stop you from progress, and then eventually you give up because you think, oh, it's not working out. But maybe it's just because you don't want to listen to other people who matter. Again, so listen to people who matter, not those that don't have any like value in it. So if it's your community members, and if they're bringing some kind of experience too, like if they're also going through a similar process or they're at the very beginning of the process. Like for example, you're an international student, you're moving to Canada, now you're just in your home country filling out some visas and stuff like that. That person can bring a lot to the table, unlike a person who has never done it. For example, I have this video about the US versus Canada. And there's a lot of Americans who don't like what I'm saying because it's like, some truths that I subjectively found, and they bring a lot of hatred towards that because they fear to be, again, ego, because they fear to that their country is worse, or that they're so insignificant they have to speak about something online that brings other people down.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's been a battle for me as well to kind of not listen to the ego, because your ego is, again, it's a part of you, it's a part of your psyche, and so it makes sense some of the time, and it takes a lot of metacognition to just push it away and continue to focus on what you're doing. So you brought up community. What is your hope for the future of Canada for yourself and for your community?
I think Canada is only at the beginning of its economical development, and there's way more to do. And I think immigrants will be that force driving it forward. I think that Canada has a lot of potential. Right now, it's the ninth largest economy in the world, but I think it can go up the list, even though projections say that it's probably gonna go the other way. But then with immigration, with what immigrants bring to the country, with the talent, the progress, my community, I believe, people that move to a different country in general, not even Canada, they are very driven and very resilient, and that's the quality that will make them leaders, be it in business or governance. Like perhaps you move to Canada and eventually you become a member of parliament, or you get elected to a city council. I know somebody who's running for a city council of Halifax, and they're an immigrant. This person moved here 12 years ago. So now, after all of that struggle, resilience, the story that the person has turned her into somebody very strong and determined to change things. So I think in general, 10 years from now, first of all, projections, numbers say that immigrant population will grow, and it might be even half of Canada. So like half of Canada will be first generation immigrants. And these immigrants over time, as I said, build businesses, employ people, become community leaders. So I just want to be a part of their journey. That's why I started Immigrant Wealth, because I realized it's not just immigration. It doesn't end there. It's just the beginning. You move here, you get permanent residency, citizenship, but then what's next, right? How do you take that and turn it into success?
Right, right. So you talked about business, you talked about finance. You're a member of Generation Z, like myself. And so, what advice would you give to a member of Generation Z about business, about finance, about life in general?
This Sunday, so the day after tomorrow, I'm about to make some big enemies in Gen. What is the one before Gen Z? Gen
Millennials, Gen Y.
Millennials, yeah, millennials, or even before that, because I'm making this video about how ChatGPT can make your letter of explanation. And letter of explanation is a legal document you need to attach to your profile when you apply for a study permit. So essentially, there's a lot of lawyers, consultants, including my own firm. We make money off people not really knowing how to do it. But I believe that progress is bigger than that, and I'd rather be on the side of progress than
Yeah,
trying to hold it back. So I'm
absolutely.
gonna share publicly how you don't need lawyers, consultants, how you can make a letter of explanation using it, like explain section by section. So it's like a free course, I would say, or something of that sort. But then also, it's going to undermine the value of immigration lawyers, consultants. And I think, going back to your question, it's important that you look at the way things are done today and see like what the previous generation or generations have been doing wrong, or what can be improved, and try to work in that area. But be specific. So for example, for me, it's student immigration. I'm talking about how to use AI in student immigration now. because this is something new, and it hasn't been done by the previous generations because this technology wasn't available or whatever other reason. So try to disrupt your area. That's my biggest advice.
Well, I just want to touch on ChatGPT because it feels like the entire world is talking about it. Just like I don't know how much you're comfortable with like the technicalities of artificial intelligence. We can just speak to the broader concepts, but like how do you feel about this technology? Because from my perspective, I mean, the last time something generated this kind of buzz was, I think, back in July or August when the Colorado State Fair gave the first prize to an AI generated art piece. And then everybody started talking about, art generators, artificial intelligence, all of this, all of this conundrum. And then now people are over the moon with this ChatGPT technology. Constantly on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, people are discovering literally how powerful it is, and students are using it, fortunately or not for teachers. So what do you think about this, I guess, new wave of powerful artificial intelligence tools?
There's always two sides. As I said before, I think in general it's good because it's going to help make our lives better. But then on the flip side of it, it removes a lot of cognitive workers, like people that use their brain to do things, and not necessarily something creative, but more like, people in the IT, software engineers, where they write a piece of code that is so the idea is brought by the project manager or whoever on the team, or like, let's say that I want to make a platform like Airbnb, then I need to convey my idea to the project manager, then they explain it to the programmers. But then how about we remove that need to re-explain everything? How about we just remove the middleman and tell AI to create it and explain exactly what it has to be? That's one thing to look at it. So I think it's going to probably eliminate the need of some technical workers. But then another side is it's only AI. It's not SI, not super intelligence. It's not something crazy, right? It's
Yep.
just an assistant, essentially. It's assistant to what you do anyway. So the way, as I said in the video, as I'm going to explain, to make a letter of explanation, you can't just ask it to write it. You need to be specific, like section by section, and then you work with it. You don't just let it write everything and then you copy and paste. You need to still add some stuff to it. But in general, it's just a way to maximize your time. So you work less, but you get the same output.
What do you think about, I mean, we're tiptoeing around automation, so I guess I'll directly ask you, what do you think about the prospect of automation with artificial intelligence and robotics? It could be for Gen Z, it could be for international students and your online community. Are you worried about it? Are you thinking about it? What's your take on it?
If I'm worried about automation,
Yeah.
I think it's good in general. Like, it's gonna make you uncomfortable at first, just like, driving a car is, but then as you learn it, it's actually good because you get around faster. I think it's the same with automation.
Interesting. Interesting. Like you perceive it as an uncomfortable transition that will result in like a net positive for society?
I think so. It's just gonna maximize the time we have. Like, it's more about, I guess, eliminating the need. Like, for example, we have tools like Calendly to schedule meetings, so there is no back and forth. So it's the same thing essentially, where it makes our lives easier. But again, it's not as developed yet. So right now, it's not dangerous. I don't think so. But then maybe over time, if we get to something more serious, then it might be dangerous to humans, but what's dangerous to humans is good to the planet.
That's that's an interesting way to put it. Um, Speaking of the planet, I feel it feels like the shockwaves of the war in Ukraine have, been felt around the world. That in March 2022, or I think it was February when it actually started. It just like sent the world down a spiral, and we're still in it. You being Ukrainian, and you spoke earlier about the war in Ukraine, and your mom came over. Do you like? Can you speak on how it affected you initially, how you've kind of coped with it? You have people over there in Ukraine, so it's a direct kind of influence on your life. Do you have any thoughts or anything like of the sort?
A similar experience, I guess, would be if you get in a car accident where like you're not you haven't fainted, like it's not something super crazy, but then like you were hit, let's say, by someone, and then you just in the first couple of minutes you don't know what to do because like you haven't been in that situation if it's your first experience. I think it's kind of like that where it's never happened before, and then you see all these fighter jets, helicopters, bombers over the capital cities, um, or just major cities, and then you don't know if it's what's going to happen because it's essentially on one hand Russia has like allegedly the second largest military, but then when it comes to practice, as we could see in 10 months or 11 months that the war has been going on, it hasn't really made such a big impact in terms of what they wanted to achieve. They were planning to take over the whole country in like 3-4 days, and now it's been like almost a year. So it's like you get in the car accident, first you're shocked, but then you get up, you call the cops, you essentially fix the problem over time. I think it's that. So I felt very lost at first, but now I guess we're just adapted to it.
That's good. That's not good, but it's a positive mindset to have about something so terrible, and you were able to kind of think about it and ponder it, and then, as you say, adapt to it. And our thoughts go out
Right.
to the people of Ukraine. We hope
Thank
this
you. I
conflict
appreciate it. Yeah, I
ends.
mean it's hard to mm, say, oh, like some people like always have regrets about things that happened, or they live in the past a lot. I'm not that type of person. If it happened, it happened. Now what can we do to fix it, to move forward? That's always the mindset I've had, and the same as with war. And luckily I'm not there physically, so it's completely different. Like I see my parents living through it, but luckily they're in Western Ukraine, so it's safer than Eastern Ukraine. But again, like it's just a different mindset I have. Like I never really looked in the past and like had any regrets.
For sure. No, it's the mindset you have of, it's we can't change the past, so we just have to figure out how to adapt for the future. I think that's
Yeah,
a beautiful mindset, and we can use it for automation. We can use it to help international students. We can use it for war. It's a very generally applicable mindset. But Max, this has
absolutely.
been this has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm really happy and excited for what you're doing. I think you're doing fantastic work, and I obviously this is only the beginning. You've only been doing this for about, 2 years. So this is just, there's no limitations for what you can accomplish, and I'm really excited to see where you
Thank
go.
you. Thank you, Yush. It was an honor being here on your podcast. I learned a lot too. I learned about the Colorado competition, how AI actually won. I didn't know about it. So thanks for enlightening me.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Gen Z Diplomat Podcast. To support it, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and add it to your favorite podcatcher. Also visit our other social platforms on TikTok and Instagram. I firmly believe that the more we talk about what future we want, the more likely we are to build a future that we need. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope to see you next time.